The moment the tape from that Giants game finished rolling, something shifted in Detroit. This wasn't just another win. This was a wake-up call, a reminder that in the NFL, every weakness shows up under the bright lights, and the Lions just had theirs exposed in a way no one expected. Because when you look past the final score, when you dive into the numbers, when you watch every snap again, you realize the defense didn't just bend, it snapped in spots that were supposed to be solid. And now, with the Thanksgiving showdown against the Packers only hours away in this timeline, the pressure isn't a talking point anymore. It's real, it's heavy, and it's sitting squarely on the shoulders of this Detroit team. If you're a true Lions fan, buckle in, because this breakdown is for you. And hey, before we jump in, don't forget to drop a like. It helps the channel roar even louder. When a single game produces 1,011 total yards, you expect some crazy shootout between two explosive offenses. But that's not what this was. The Giants put up 517 yards. The Lions put up 494. These weren't two elite units trading haymakers. These were two defenses failing to get stops. And for Detroit, the biggest frustration wasn't even the yards. It was the feeling of watching a quarterback stand there, untouched, surveying the field like he had all day. Because that's exactly what happened. Jameis Winston had what felt like a lounge chair in the pocket. Nearly 3.5 seconds per throw. In a league where 2.7 seconds is the average. That difference isn't small. It's catastrophic. And when you combine that with losing Josh Paschal for the season, the frustration only grows. You lose one of your rotational anchors on the defensive line, a guy who could set an edge, collapse a pocket, eat a gap, and what's left now hinges on the return of Marcus Davenport. He is, for better or worse, the hope. He's all this team has at the moment in terms of adding immediate juice to the pass rush. And that's the part that stings. The Lions don't have some secret reinforcement waiting on the practice squad. Andre Carter too was poached. There's no hidden gem coming. The guys they have now are the guys they will finish the season with. That's why these defensive rankings hit so hard. A week ago, the Lions were riding high, top 10 in total defense and in points allowed for the first time all year. It felt like the early season climb was real, but then everything collapsed in one Sunday. Total defense, from 5th to 11th. Passing defense, 8th to 15th. Rushing defense, down again. Even sacks, once a strength, are now slipping away week after week. 2nd, 4th, 6th, 8th. That's not a plateau. That's a free fall. And when you look at those 4 straight weeks of decline, it becomes impossible to deny the pattern. The pass rush isn't just cooling off, it's vanishing at the exact moment contenders ramp theirs up. This is why the conversation about coverage versus pass rush finally settled itself on the field. Yes, getting Kirby Joseph back will help. Yes, having Terry and Arnold eventually return matters. But none of that fixes the core issue if the quarterback has 3.5 seconds to stand back there untouched. Pressure makes average corners look functional. No pressure makes good corners look overwhelmed. We saw Jerry Jacobs get interceptions earlier this year not because he suddenly turned into a shutdown corner, but because the pass rush forced hurried throws. Without pressure, everything falls apart. And here's the part that should concern every Lions fan. This team is one win away from getting back into the playoff picture, but also one loss away from staying on the outside no matter what happens elsewhere in the NFC. The margin is razor thin, and the stretch ahead is packed with NFC opponents, division opponents, and must-win matchups that demand a defense capable of finishing games, not just surviving them. Frank Ragnow's return should be a blessing. It should be one of the biggest morale boosts this team has gotten all season. But imagine wasting that return, wasting a Hall of Fame caliber center coming out of retirement because the defense can't get to the quarterback. That's the fear creeping in. That's the thought Detroit cannot afford to let become reality. And yet, despite the concerns, despite the drop-offs, despite the injuries and the declining rankings, there's still belief. There's still the sense that Davenport's return could steady the front, that Hutchinson can close the gap on Micah Parsons, that Muhammad can finally make an appearance, that the defense can rebound enough to keep the Lions in the hunt. Because this game against Green Bay isn't just another holiday matchup, it's the difference between controlling your path or chasing the standings the rest of the way. So the question now becomes the one no fan loves to ask but every fan is thinking, after seeing this defensive collapse and the rankings crashing across the board, do you still believe this Lions defense can bounce back at the most critical part of the season? The truth is, when you step back and look at everything unfolding around this team, you can feel the tension tightening. Not panic, not collapse, Tension. The kind that happens when a season reaches its breaking point, because as much as fans want to focus on the Packers game, and as much as the coaching staff wants to frame this as just another week, we all know better. This stretch isn't normal. It isn't routine. It's the season being put on trial, and the verdict will be written by what this defense does from here forward. And that's why the steady decline in sacks matters more than any single blown coverage or missed tackle. Let's be honest, the drop from second in the league to eighth in just a month isn't some random statistical quirk. It's a symptom of a front four that's losing its bite, a rotation that's thinning, a unit that isn't finishing plays like it did at the start of the year. You can feel it in the way opposing quarterbacks look comfortable. You can feel it in the way receivers are getting to the top of their routes without disruption. You can feel it in the way the Lions are being forced to chase the game instead of setting the tone. What's wild is that the secondary actually does have help coming. Terrion Arnold, DJ Reed, eventually Kirby Joseph, those guys will matter. Their return does stabilize things on the back end, and without question the communication improves when they're out there. But again, none of that means anything if quarterbacks aren't being forced into decisions they don't want to make. That's what makes the return of Marcus Davenport such a central storyline. Not because he's guaranteed to be a savior, but because this team simply needs someone other than Aiden Hutchinson to land a punch. And the Lions know exactly what's at stake. Look at the schedule. Look at the Rams game looming without Frank Ragnow likely available. Look at the NFC matchups stacked like dominoes behind it. There's no cushion, no margin for error. Every loss becomes an anchor. Every win lifts the entire season. And that's why this Thanksgiving matchup, this supposed tradition game, suddenly carries the weight of a postseason eliminator. But here's the part that can't be overlooked. The offense isn't the concern. Not right now. Jared Goff having the third least time to throw last week compared to Winston having the most in the league is the kind of contrast that exposes the reality on tape. Detroit doesn't need Goff to be superhuman. They need the defense to stop asking him to be. They need a sack before the fourth quarter. They need pressure before the final drive. They need to reclaim the identity that pushed them into the top 10 in the first place. Because if they can do that, even just return to average in the pass rush for the next few weeks, the playoff door swings back open. The momentum shifts again. Ragnow's return becomes a spark instead of a wasted miracle. The stress surrounding these rankings becomes background noise instead of a warning siren. The difference between spiraling and stabilizing is thinner than people realize. And let's be real, Lions fans have seen this team fight back from worse. They've witnessed seasons where the roster had no depth, no direction, no identity, and still clawed its way through games. This group is much better than that. This roster is far more talented, and the coaching staff has shown enough growth to avoid letting a single defensive collapse define the final stretch. So now, as we continue this conversation and move deeper into what comes next for Detroit, the storyline sharpens. Can this defense, with all the hits it has taken, find enough within itself to rise again? Can Marcus Davenport change the rhythm of this front? Can Hutchinson finish the year the way a star should? Can the Lions turn this slide into fuel instead of frustration? Before we push further into that question and the implications it carries for the rest of the season, tell me this. Do you believe the Lions have the personnel right now to fix this problem in time? Or are they one injury away from watching the postseason slip through their fingers? Then we dive deeper into what this team truly faces over the weeks ahead. Because the closer you look, the more clear it becomes that the Lions are fighting on two fronts at the same time. The external pressure, the standings, the playoff picture, the divisional matchups is obvious to everyone. But the internal battle is the one that will decide whether this team rises or unravels. It's the battle between who they were earlier in the season and who they became against the Giants. It's the battle between the identity they're trying to protect and the cracks that suddenly showed up all at once. You can feel that internal tension in the way the defense has started reacting instead of attacking. Early in the year, this unit played downhill. They set the tone. They smothered the run, forced third and longs, and collapsed pockets with a confidence that made every snap feel like a threat. But over the last month, that has changed. Opposing offenses aren't being forced off schedule. Quarterbacks are sitting comfortably in the pocket. Even when the Lions force a long down and distance, the lack of pressure gives opponents a chance they shouldn't have. And that slow, steady slide is what has transformed a once top 5 defense into a unit floating outside the top 10 in nearly every major category. The coaches know this. You can hear it in every breakdown, every press conference, every subtle shift in tone. They know this defense isn't doing what it was built to do. They know the pass rush has gone from strength to liability, and they know that if they don't correct it, every other improvement, the return of Frank Ragnow, the getting healthy secondary, the offensive efficiency, becomes irrelevant. A football team can only be carried so far by its offense before the weight becomes too much. And that's why the return of Marcus Davenport isn't just a storyline, it's a crossroads. He doesn't need to be a superstar. He doesn't need multiple sacks. He just needs to tilt the pocket enough that Hutchinson isn't facing double teams every single snap. He needs to rush with enough force that quarterbacks can't step comfortably into their throws. Sometimes one disruptive presence changes everything for a defensive front, and the Lions are hoping Davenport is exactly that kind of catalyst. The other reality is that the Lions don't have time to ease him in. Not with the stretch of opponents lining up, 3 straight NFC matchups, multiple divisional games, the Rams and Cowboys waiting, and a Steelers team likely fighting for its playoff life. All of that is coming fast, and every game affects the standings. Every game affects the tiebreakers. Every snap affects whether this team controls its destiny or watches other NFC contenders pass them by. The urgency is real, but so is the opportunity, because if the Lions can correct the defensive slide, even just partially, this team immediately becomes dangerous again. The offense is stable. The special teams have been consistent. The locker room believes in its leadership. This isn't a team in chaos. It's a team in need of a jolt before the season hits its final turn. And in the NFL, momentum doesn't have to take weeks to build. Sometimes it shifts in a single quarter, a single drive, a single defensive stop that ignites the sideline and resets the tone. The Lions don't need perfection. They need impact. They need urgency. They need to rediscover the aggression that built their identity at the start of the season. And they need to do it now, before the standings make the decision for them. So here's where I turn it back to the fans one more time before wrapping this up. With Ragnow returning, Davenport stepping back in, and the playoff door still open, do you believe this defense can turn the corner in time to make a real push? If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to stay locked in for every twist and turn of this playoff chase, make sure you're subscribed, drop a like to support the channel, and stick around. Your next video is already waiting on the screen. And when you zoom out just a little further, the emotional heartbeat of this entire situation becomes even clearer. Lions fans aren't just hoping for a turnaround, they're demanding clarity. They want to know which version of this defense is real, the one that bulldozed its way into the top 5 earlier in the year, or the one that collapsed so dramatically against the Giants. Because it's hard to reconcile how a unit that looked so connected, so disciplined, so explosive at the start of the season suddenly looks hesitant and disjointed. Part of that shift comes from something fans don't always see in the box score: trust. Trust between the defensive front and the secondary. Trust between the play callers and the personnel. Trust that if you do your job, the guy next to you will do his. When a defense is rolling, that trust becomes invisible. It's automatic. But when injuries pile up, roles change, and production drops off, trust becomes fragile. Suddenly players are trying to compensate, trying to do too much, trying to cover ground that isn't theirs. That's how breakdowns happen. And you could see that clearly on tape in the Giants game. But the encouraging part, the part the Lions are clinging to, is that trust can be rebuilt just as fast as it breaks. A big hit, a sudden sack, a stop on 3rd and 2. Those moments reset everything. They remind the defense who they are, what they've built, and what they're capable of when the unit is aligned. And that's why the urgency this week is unlike any other week so far. This defense needs that spark, that reset, that moment where everything clicks again. This is also where the returning players matter more than any specific stat. Terrion Arnold brings communication. DJ Reed brings stability. Kirby Joseph brings range. Each one helps plug a leak that's been widening over the last month. But none of them, not one, can replace a pass rush that isn't landing home. That responsibility sits on the front 4 and on the coaching staff's willingness to adjust before it's too late. And after watching the Lions fall from 5th to 11th in total defense, after watching their sack ranking crumble week by week, after seeing Winston look untouched for most of the game, the coaching staff knows that one adjustment won't fix everything. This requires urgency, creativity, and accountability. It requires leaning on Hutchinson, demanding more out of the rotation, and setting a standard for Davenport the moment he steps back on the field. Because the truth is, he doesn't have the luxury of easing in. Not in November. Not in a playoff race. Not with the division still within striking distance. Still, as tense as all of this sounds, there's a strange optimism underneath it. The kind of optimism that comes from knowing this team has climbed out of worse situations with less talent. There's a belief that once this defense lands one breakout performance, the slope of decline can flip right back into an upward climb. And that's what makes the coming game so compelling. Every snap has weight, every adjustment has consequences, and every defensive stand has the potential to reshape the entire playoff picture. So as the Lions prepare for this defining stretch, as Davenport returns, as the secondary heals, and as Ragno's presence lifts the offense, the question becomes simple. Do they rise to meet the moment, or do they let this slow defensive unraveling become the story of their season? And even after laying all of that out, there's still another layer to this story that deserves attention: the emotional toll this stretch is taking on the players themselves. Fans feel the pressure, sure, but players live in it. They carry it into every meeting, every rep, every film session. And when a defense drops across the board the way Detroit's just did, the weight isn't abstract. It's personal. You can see it in the way veterans talk on the sideline. You can feel it in the urgency of practice reports. There's a sense that everyone understands this isn't just a slump, it's a crossroads moment that could define the legacy of this season. Aiden Hutchinson is at the center of that weight. He's the face of the pass rush, the engine, the tone setter. And no matter how many pressures he generates, the reality is simple: the Lions need him finishing plays again. They need him closing out drives. They need him forcing offenses to adjust their protections, not settling comfortably into them. He's not shying away from that responsibility. You can see it in the way he keeps talking about execution, finish, detail. But every great edge rusher eventually reaches a moment where effort alone isn't enough. Hutchinson needs help, and this could be the week he finally gets it, because Davenport's return changes spacing. It changes how lines slide protections. It changes how much attention Hutchinson gets pre-snap. When you take away isolation opportunities, even elite pass rushers look neutralized. But when you force offenses into true one-on-one situations, the entire dynamic shifts. And with Davenport's size, length, and physicality on the edge, the Lions finally have a chance to tilt matchups back in their favor. The question is whether they can capitalize before the standings tighten even further. And speaking of the standings, that's another place where the urgency becomes undeniable. The path back into the playoffs is right there, not wide open, not easy, but within reach. A win shifts the narrative overnight. A loss forces Detroit to claw through a tougher, more complicated path with little room for error. That's what makes this stretch so heavy. Every game feels like two. Every outcome feels multiplied, and the Lions know it. Yet through all of that, this team still has something most of Detroit's past rosters lacked: resilience. Not the cliché version, but real, on-field resilience. The kind that's built through comebacks, through adversity, through long injury stretches where depth pieces stepped up and delivered. The kind that doesn't disappear after one ugly game. And that's why there's still belief that this defense can jolt back to life, that the front can start winning again, that this slide doesn't have to define the final month. Momentum has always been a strange force in football: unpredictable, fragile,